government. And also, we have another very precious guest, Ambassador Joe Yoon. You have all seen him on CNN, and during our discussion, Ambassador Yoon will make a lot of interesting comments. Okay, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moon, esteemed members of the National Assembly. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to be back here in South Korea. As Chung-in mentioned, I've been invited also to speak at the DMZ 2019 forum. And in fact, yesterday I had the pleasure with that forum to tour the DMZ area. And I must confess, it was my first time there. I had more or less seen it from the other side. You know, as one goes there, one looks through the looking glass to see North Korea. I've actually had the pleasure of being on North Korea's side, you know, and looking this way. And also, I was fascinated and really pleased to be with a group of women that are called Women Crossing DMZ, and you're probably aware of that. I had the pleasure of being in the company of Gloria Steinem for most of the day yesterday and the dinner. So it was a great pleasure to be there, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And so Chung-in asked me to sort of share my latest thoughts about the North Korea nuclear situation. Pleasure to see you. And so I thought I would do that. And for today's lecture, I thought maybe the best way to approach this is to see, now knowing what we know in 2019, can we look backwards and try to assess what were the key decision points in North Korea's nuclear program, both from American side and also from a North Korean side. And so that's the approach to my discussion today. So let me start with what I think is the most recent and perhaps one of the most important key decision points. And it's what happened, or perhaps didn't happen, in Hanoi. So here is a photo of the Hanoi summit. Let me just ask if it's possible at all to turn the lights up front down a bit. It will show the photographs better. I'm not sure if that's possible from your side, but it would help. So here was Hanoi, and as you well know, even though the camaraderie was still there between President Trump and Chairman Kim, they walked away. And the Americans, you know, had one particular story for why they walked away. But it turns out it was very different than the North Korean story, because at the midnight news conference held with Minister Lee Young-ho and Vice Minister Madam Choi Sun-hui, they had a very different story. They said, no, we didn't ask for all sanctions relief, and we were willing to give up a lot. But by that time, it was too late. So the two countries had different stories. They walked away. And in fact, what was curious is the reception on the United States side. And this was one of the few times when President Trump received sort of plaudits from both the left and the right in the United States. And it was, you know, Trump was right to walk away. No deal was better than a bad deal. But the question that I'm here to address today, you know, was he really right to walk away? Was it a good decision, or was it what my colleague Bob Calvin and I call a hinge point? And a hinge point is sort of a decisive point, and it's usually, as we look back, it's where bad decisions have bad consequences. And so that's what I want to examine. So how much was Hanoi not just the right decision, but it was rather a hinge point? But as I think most of you know, I'm a technical person, not a diplomat. And I happen to think that the technical details matter. So if we going to assess, was President Trump correct walking away from Hanoi, you have to understand what Hanoi was all about, technically from a nuclear standpoint, and of course politically. And so what I've tried to do is to integrate those two, make sure we look both at the technical issues as well as the political issues. And so the one thing that I try to teach my students when we talk about nuclear weapons is don't just say nuclear weapons or nukes. Really think about what does it take to have a nuclear arsenal. And some of you have seen me present this before, but it takes three things. One, it takes the bomb fuel, the nuclear fuel, and that is for what we call fission bombs, the sort that we used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That would mean highly enriched uranium and plutonium. If you want to make a hydrogen bomb, which is significantly more powerful than an atomic bomb, then you also need forms of hydrogen, heavy hydrogen, so deuterium and tritium. So it turns out this, for particularly a country that's starting a nuclear weapons program, is the most difficult because it takes a lot to make plutonium. You have to make it in a reactor. So that means you got to build a reactor and go ahead and run the reactor. And then you have to extract the plutonium in what we call reprocessing. So those are huge enterprises, and it takes a lot of people and a lot of money to do so. And then tritium, you also need a reactor to make tritium, so that's also quite an operation. So first of all, you need the bomb fuel. And then second, weaponization. And what I mean by that is to design, to build, and to test a nuclear weapon. And that requires all the things that I have on here, from understanding physics, computers, high explosives, all the way down to nuclear testing. So that's also a very important part. And then if it's going to be a nuclear arsenal, you have to be able to deliver it, the bomb. And so that then requires a delivery system. And quite clearly, North Korea has focused on missiles. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were B-29 planes. So those are the important things. And as I point out in the top line, the bomb fuel, how much you have, in the case of North Korea, it would govern how many bombs they have. In other words, the size of the arsenal. The weaponization, particularly the nuclear testing part, is that governs the sophistication. So in other words, do they really have a fission bomb, or is it a fusion, namely hydrogen bomb? And then the missile, the delivery system, it governs how threatening the nuclear arsenal is. So if they can put it on a missile and be able to reach South Korea or Japan, in minutes, or the United States in 20, 30 minutes, that governs as to who is threatened. So that's what one needs to understand. And so whenever I look at the North Korean nuclear program, I look at all three of those. And then, however, if anybody tells you North Korea has X number of nuclear weapons, the first thing you should ask is, how do you know? Especially with a country like North Korea. It's not easy to look inside, and at least from what I know, we don't have anybody inside. And so the question, how do we know, and how confident are we in any of these estimates? It's important to recognize that, because only then can we really have a good assessment. So the way we know, let me just go through that very quickly, is of course in today's world it's overhead satellite imagery. That used to be only the purview of the intelligence agencies, but today you can do that with open source, publicly available satellites. North Korea is the most watched place in the entire Earth, and so there's lots of that satellite imagery. And here's just a case of satellites watching the building of what we call the experimental light water reactor in Yongbyon. And it was right here in November of 2010. if this, let's see. Okay, this doesn't work. So it's the upper left that's when I saw that reactor actually coming out of the ground. And it was only after I was there that then satellite imagery said, oh yes, they're starting to build a reactor. And then you can watch them, over the years. There we go. Thank you. That was off. Okay. So you can watch them over the years, and then you can see when the reactor was done on the outside. However, now we are in 2019, and it doesn't look like that reactor has operated as yet. Maybe getting very close. So we don't know why. It was finished outside in December of 2013, clearly finished, but yet it's not operating. So you'd like to be on the inside. Well, it turns out, for reasons that Professor Moon mentioned, so I've been there in North Korea, and so they've invited me in to see their nuclear facilities. In this particular visit, I was actually visiting their plutonium laboratories. And as you might imagine, from visiting those facilities and then talking to their technical people, you learn a lot as to what are they actually capable of doing. Not just what they're telling you, but what they're actually capable of doing. So in my case, then, when I put together my estimates, I try to use all the knowledge that I have from being in the nuclear business for more than 50 years, and then also having visited North Korea. It's still, as I will tell you, there's still great uncertainties, but at least it gives you a little bit better idea. And then, lo and behold, this is quite strange, the North Koreans actually show you a lot. Okay, they show Kim Jong-un, and before him Kim Jong-il, going to these various missile and nuclear places, and you learn a lot from what you see. Of course, you don't believe everything that they show you, but nevertheless, it tells you a lot. And here is Kim Jong-un presumably inspecting a miniaturized nuclear warhead back in 2016. Okay, so now to give you a sense as to looking back at these key decision points, rather than picking out a particular year or a particular event or what one might call, what I often call provocations by the North Koreans, I don't think those are provocations. It's a story of the entire evolution of that nuclear program. And my colleagues and I at Stanford have done this. And what we did, and I know this is somewhat difficult to read, but if you look here from 1992 up through 2017, we year by year followed the evolution of their program. So we looked at things like diplomatic efforts by the United States, by North Korea. We looked at whether those diplomatic efforts actually resulted in having technical people on the ground in Yongbyon. In other words, was the diplomacy close enough that you actually had Americans or IAE inspectors in Yongbyon? It turns out that's very important, so we tracked that. And then we did this, what I just showed you, all the three phases of nuclear weapons. We tracked, did they make plutonium, uranium enrichment? Did they make the hydrogen bomb fuels like tritium? Did they weaponize, design, build, test? Then summarize those and then look at the missiles. So we did that, and each one of those boxes we have a long narrative, and we explain what happened. So it's like 100 pages. But we know that at least in Washington, I don't know if it's the same way in Seoul, but people in our capital don't read 100 pages. In fact, they don't often read one page. And so we came up with the thought that, well, maybe we can track this in a visual way with colors. And so we said, well, let's color the activities that happen green if they're good from an American perspective. And the darker the green, the better, 3 shades of green. And then if they're bad, we'll make them red. The better, the worse, the more deeper the red. Okay, so I won't take you at this point through all of those, but I'm just going to give you the mosaic of the results. Okay, and here they are. So here's the mosaic. And what it shows, and by the way, the white lines here that go across are the different presidents coming in on the United States side. So these are 5 presidents. End of George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and then Trump coming in. And so what you see here is during the Clinton time, there was a lot of diplomacy. And of course, those of you who've been tracking North Korea for a long time, you know that. There was a lot of diplomacy. And as far as plutonium goes, it was very good. They actually backed off and stopped the plutonium production. They let 2 big reactors die altogether. Those were really important advantages. In terms of uranium enrichment, what you actually found was initially they didn't do much damage, but then they did start in 1997 or so, look more closely at the potential of uranium enrichment. And then you can see in terms of weaponizing, even while there was diplomacy, they never, in our opinion, they never sent their weapons designers home. They didn't just stop thinking about nuclear weapons. They sort of kept a hedge, just in case they would need this. And then, in terms of the summary, you can see things are pretty good as far as nukes for most of those years. And as far as missiles, yes, of course they were working on missiles, short-range missiles. They were selling missiles, actually. But then they had a moratorium as part of the agreed framework, which came in 1994. So then came President George W. Bush, and he and his team did not like the agreed framework. They said it was the worst deal ever made. Sounds familiar when one listens about the Iran deal. And so they cut the diplomacy. So diplomacy went from green to red, and it took only a little while before then North Korea reestablished its plutonium capabilities. They continued uranium enrichment. They started to make some tritium, at least so we think. And then weaponization, they became serious about building the bomb, and they did. And then eventually, in terms of the summary, in 2006, they actually tested the bomb for the first time. This one didn't work so well, but they tested. Okay, then President Bush, in the last 2 years, he did some diplomacy. That's when Ambassador Chris Hill spent a lot of time with the North Korean. And so that turned things back a little bit, but it sort of never stopped. It turned it from dark red, to light red. And then President Obama came in, and one would have thought, with President Obama wanting to reach out his hands, if somebody unclenched their fist, that it would have gotten better, but it didn't. It didn't. And so then things turned more and more red. Then in comes President Trump, for those of you who can see the last line, and then everything turned red during President Trump's first year. So that's sort of the mosaic of what their program actually was. Not just what you think by going in and picking one box out of this whole. So that's what we then used to try to understand the program. So the bottom line of all of that, then by the end of 2017, so after President Trump's first year, we think this is sort of the best estimate. The plutonium, 20 to 40 kilograms, it only takes 5 or so kilograms to make a bomb, but it's not a huge amount. The highly enriched uranium, in spite of the fact that I saw their facility, I said already when I visited in 2010, it's clear when I saw that facility, they have to have another facility someplace else. And we don't know exactly where it is. There are various reports. But it's important to keep in mind that this is highly uncertain. So this is our guess. And tritium, the hydrogen bomb fuel, very limited, we think. Nuclear devices at that time, maybe enough nuclear materials for 25 to 30. Again, highly uncertain. Can they deliver those nuclear warheads on a short-range missile, the Scud or the Nodon, the medium range? I have to come to the conclusion at this point, I think the answer is yes. So in other words, they can most likely reach all of South Korea and most of Japan, based on the fact that they've done many, many of those short-range tests and that they've done enough nuclear tests that they should be able to miniaturize. However, when it comes to ICBMs or intermediate range, my own view is no. They have not done enough missile tests, they've not done enough nuclear tests, and unless they go back and do more, they can't yet put a warhead on an ICBM that is militarily effective. And so that's important to remember. So if you want to judge as to what North Korea has done or has not done since the Singapore summit, you have to understand where we are. And again, this is only my estimate, because in the end, we don't know for sure. But, okay, so, but that's a pretty bad story, isn't it? I mean, they have plutonium, they have uranium, they have some tritium, they have these bombs, they can deliver them. How could this happen? You know, how, with the whole world watching, how could this happen? Well, you know, one thing is the Kims were determined to do nuclear things, all the way from Kim Il-sung through Kim Jong-il through Kim Jong-un. And it just gives you a little bit of a timeline as to best that we can figure out. But this isn't just Kim Jong-un doing this. I mean, it's a history of all three Kims. They've been incredibly successful. They got their start initially with the Soviets' Atoms for Peace. But Soviets told them, don't you dare build a bomb. But they gave them help with civilian nuclear, and then the North Koreans indigenously trained their people, did a lot of work. And so what you have to respect is their competence in the nuclear field and their persistence. That's what I found out. Of course, persistence is a particularly Korean characteristic, whether you're south or north, whether it's on the golf course or in the nuclear business. So they've done a lot of this, and they've been determined and deliberate in the pursuit of that arsenal. So now let's look at it from the standpoint of the Kims. So now the blue lines show the various Kim dynasties, from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. And then you can also see, as I showed before, when the nuclear tests actually happened, and there's 6 of them altogether. So the one thing we have to remember is the Kims were determined. They were willing to engage in diplomacy, but they never left themselves without an option. In other words, without a hedge, and that's the way that I interpret the colors. And that's what we have to understand. So now, in terms of key decision points, let me go back to U.S. key decision points, and the things that we call hinge points. So a most critical decision point was between the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. So in other words, up here in 2000. And it actually happened, in effect, in October of 2002 with the visit of James Kelly to Pyongyang. But in essence, the Bush administration decided that agreed framework was a bad deal, and indeed they were able to destroy that deal. And the reason that they used was the fact that North Korea was clandestinely enriching uranium while it was indeed freezing the Yongbyon plutonium facilities. Well, it turns out the Clinton administration actually also knew that. And you can see I've colored this as sort of a light red. They were watching, and they knew the North Koreans were doing some things in order to try to build up its nuclear uranium enrichment capabilities. The Clinton administration decided to take advantage of the plutonium freeze and deal with the uranium later. The Bush administration did not want to do that, and so they used that as sort of, as some have said, the hammer to smash the agreed framework. And it was smashed. And then you can see what happened. When it was smashed, how things went red, including that first nuclear test. So that was a hinge point. It was an unfortunate decision where essentially a U.S. administration threw away a deal that even if North Korea was developing uranium enrichment and had gotten better, it would take a decade before they could build a bomb. And instead, they were able to build a bomb within a year because they had plutonium in the spent fuel pool. They were able to bring that out, extract it, and build the bomb, and then test the bomb, here. So that's what I consider a bad decision, a hinge point. And then, of course, as you go on, and President Obama then tries his hand, and I will explain this from the North Korean side in a minute. There were things on the North Korean side where I think they believed they had to proceed with a second nuclear test because the first one did not work well. So they had to convince themselves, the technical people, they had to convince the military, they had to convince Kim Jong-il, and they had to convince the world. And so they did do a second nuclear test. When they did that, Obama administration really never recovered. By 2012, though, the North Koreans, this was actually set up initially still by Kim Jong-il, but he died in December 2011. He was taken over by his young son, is to do what was called the Leap Day deal, where they actually agreed that even though the inspectors had been thrown out of Yongbyon back here in early 2009, that they would let them back in, and they would stop making plutonium, and they would even show their uranium enrichment facilities, which I saw in 2010. But Obama administration rejected that deal because the North Koreans launched a satellite, and there was a misunderstanding, or I think an intentional misunderstanding, where the Americans said no missiles, no rockets, nothing. And the North Koreans said, no, we can do rockets. Lots of countries do rockets. They went ahead and proceeded, and then things went badly. So again, this was a decision by the United States at that time to say, no, we don't want the space launch, and therefore we're going to stop. And they did. 2015 was another attempt by Kim Jong-un in January when he said, I'm willing to do a nuclear testing moratorium. Obama administration dismissed that immediately. And what happened after that? Excuse me. What happened after that was a whole flurry of nuclear tests that were really crucial to their arsenal. So again, it was a questionable decision. But let me spend time actually on what about the North Korean side. And this is the trickiest part of my presentation, because in the end, I don't really know how the North Koreans thought, what made them do what they did. But what I do now is having this color chart, knowing what happened after various times and decisions, you can go back and say, well, I think that's what actually happened. And that's sort of what my story is here. So big decision was in 1991-92, and you're well familiar with that. North and South got together, signed a joint statement, and where Kim Il-sung, for various reasons, including, of course, Soviet Union collapsing, China actually, signing an agreement that they would work with South Korea, his world just fell apart, and he decided, at least from the best I can understand, maybe the Americans aren't so bad after all. And so started talking with the Americans late in that period of late 1980s, early 1990s, and eventually in 1994, then came the agreed framework. So that's what I'm going to show here. And if you keep your eye on the year, so that was one of the key decision points by North Korea. The next key decision point was in 1994 when Kim Il-sung decided they would actually try to get an agreement with the Americans. Of course, he died before the October agreement it's really not an agreement, then it's a framework. So the agreed framework in 1994. Then the next decision point was likely around 1997, when I believe the North Koreans were starting to think, we're not sure the Americans are actually going to come through with their part of this, because we had a lot of our congressmen and women were very much against the agreed framework, and that is the Republicans that came in the 1994 election. And so the Americans were somewhat slow in keeping up their part of the agreed framework. I won't repeat all of the details of that, but you know it's to build 2 light water reactors in conjunction with South Korea and Japan, and the North Koreans to shut down their plutonium program. However, at that point, I believe they decided it's better to hedge, and so they increased their uranium enrichment activities throughout the rest of the Clinton administration. Again, they didn't send their nuclear weapons designers home, and so they kept that option open. Okay, then the next key decision point is indeed October 2002, 2003, when the Americans actually did walk away from the agreed framework, and the North Koreans at that point, that decision point was, we're going to build the bomb. And they did. They took the plutonium that had been sitting since 1994 in the spent fuel pool, took it out, reprocessed it, and built the bomb sometime in 2003, early 2004. When the Bush administration still was not terribly interested in talking with the North Koreans, then they find, oh, I should say first, before that time, the North Koreans actually had agreed in 2005, in September 19, 2005, to sign the joint statement. This was part of the 6-party talks. And so the joint statement was signed. It was, quite frankly, a very simple document, but had great potential. At the same time, though, the Americans then issued the Banco Delta Asia sanctions. So one part of the government signed an agreement, another part of the government sanctioned, and the North Koreans walked away. So they decided at that point, no, they're going to walk away, and that led eventually to this nuclear test in 2006. And the nuclear test is a big deal, even though it didn't work that well. It was somewhere around a kiloton. Hiroshima was maybe 15 kilotons, Nagasaki 21. So I mean, something went wrong. But once you get a kiloton, that means you know how to make a fission bomb at least start. And so to me it was clear they would be able to manage it, but they had to test again. And so that was the decision that was made at that time. The next decision point then was in 2008. It's probably my most controversial observation. My own view is that in spite of the fact that North Koreans and the Bush administration were actually talking with each other and making some progress, by late 2008, the North Koreans made a decision they're going to proceed full speed with their nuclear program. And sort of the best that I can understand that is Kim Jong-il had a stroke in August of 2008. And so there was a big question as to what happens with succession. There's a big question actually into how do you keep the military on one side, and so they did not want to look weak. And I believe they made a decision already in late 2008 that they're going to really go full speed. And if you look at the nuclear program, you can see how things went red. They did another test in 2009. And that one, let's say, it worked, and things turned red. So they made the decision here that unfortunately, it's right at the time that President Obama comes into office. They do the rocket launch, and they do a nuclear test, and it essentially set the stage for the next 8 years in the Obama administration. So around then, the time of 2012, they did this leap day deal where at least what they showed is they were willing to sort of test diplomacy again. I'm not sure they'd necessarily actually come, to full agreement, but at least to test the diplomacy. And since that was rejected, they continued to proceed, and things get red and red. 2015, they make a test, and it was rejected, and things can turn more and more red, including these 2 nuclear tests in 2016. Those were very important. In my opinion, one of them was sort of a proof test for a hydrogen bomb. The other was most likely a proof test for a miniaturized bomb. And then comes President Trump, and so now there was another decision point, at least again the best that I can sort of put it together from the back end, is then by late 2017, 2018, they made the decision that they had demonstrated they have an ICBM range rocket. They had demonstrated that they most likely can make a hydrogen bomb with the September 3rd tests in 2017. And you have President Moon here in South Korea who reaches across. You have the Olympics coming up, and Kim Jong-un decides that they're going to participate in the Olympics, has a summit with President Moon, winds up with a summit with President Trump, and things change dramatically. So that's where we were, 2018. And here they are in Singapore at the 2018 summit. A lot of people have criticized that for not amounting to much. To me, it was a watershed. It was an extremely important event because, as I show here, in 2017, everything turned red, dark red. 2017 was a dangerous, dangerous time on the Korean Peninsula. And the Singapore summit, for whatever the substance was, walked away from that precipice of war. So it was a key decision to make. And President Trump, to his credit, was willing to meet. And then, we come to Hanoi, and of course there was a lot of time between June of 2012 and end of February of 2018, and unfortunately, not much happened in that time frame. So in terms of decision points and strategy, it would seem to me from the North Korean side, they for the most part didn't want to talk. And that made it extremely difficult then for the Americans to follow up. And of course on the American side there were still many different opinions, within the Trump administration itself, and certainly across the whole government. So we wind up with Hanoi. And then we wind up in April 2019 with sort of an update of here. So they have a little more plutonium because they were making plutonium up into 2018 and most likely extracted some in 2018. So they have a few more nuclear devices. Situation here is the same. They can deliver a nuclear warhead to South Korea and to Japan, and still not militarily useful in terms of ICBMs. So, but the question then is Hanoi another hinge point? Things could indeed get worse if they indeed perfect those capabilities. And what the North Koreans have shown time and time again, what that chart shows, they are resourceful. And if they stop, once they get started, they'll get there. And so you sort of have to assume they're going to be able to do all of these things if they're left to their own devices. So then President Trump, since not much happened, after Hanoi either, and particularly after Hanoi, from the best I understand, North Koreans didn't answer the phone to the United States. And so it took President Trump, while he was over here, to go up to the DMZ, to Panmunjom, step across the divide, and perhaps jumpstart this activity again. And so now, if I then take this and update it to September 2019, again, not much has changed. However, what's happened in the meantime is the North Koreans from September of 2017 have done no more nuclear tests. And actually they've made it more difficult for them to go back to testing by disabling, partially dismantling the nuclear test center. They have not done an intermediate or long-range ICBM test. Those, again, if you look back at my chart of the three things, those are crucial to have a militarily useful hydrogen bomb, a militarily useful ICBM deliverable bomb. And they have not done that. However, absent an agreement from any of those, they continue to run the centrifuges, the best as we can tell. So the centrifuges in Yongbyon and whatever the other site is, we assume, and that's what I assume here. So they keep making highly enriched uranium. Maybe, again, best estimate is maybe 150 kilograms a year, or sort of 6 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium. But it turns out plutonium is much more important for sophisticated weapons, and they have not operated their reactor since sometime in 2018. So right now they're not making more plutonium. I don't think it's for political reasons. I think they're dealing with some technical issues, such as cooling for the old reactor, what we call the 5 megawatt reactor, and trying to bring the new reactor online. And so we see lots of activity going on in Yongbyon, but they're not making a lot. But they're making highly enriched uranium. But they're not making progress on the big things. However, as you well know, now since May, they broke a 522 timeline of not having done any missile tests. And they've now done sort of 10 batteries of either short-range ballistic missiles or these multiple rocket launchers. And that's what they've done, including a solid propellant missile that's called more or less the KN-23. So since May, they have made progress on these solid propellant short range. And as I'll show you in a minute, that's one of the things that I had hoped we could stop in North Korea. So it's not good for them to go ahead and do this, because it makes those missiles much quicker to use, and it's going to teach them how to do the first stage of an ICBM with a solid fuel. And so you'd rather not have them do that. It doesn't change, in my opinion, the military balance at this point, but it's directions that you I wouldn't have wanted them to go. Okay, so what is the situation? Here we are, post-Hanoi, post-Panmunjom, and we're still not making progress, although the last week or so has shown some signs, so maybe something loosening up. But as I try to assess, so why can't we go ahead and sort of get over that threshold and make more progress? I've tried to capture in these next 2 slides, and that is, so the American posture is that President Trump has decided that he would move with North Korea towards what I call non-hostile relations. And those of you who've dealt with North Korea, you know that has been their primary complaint about Americans and their hostile relations. Well, President Trump, clearly, from what he's done with Kim Jong-un, that's not hostile. It's close to their friendship, at least at the top levels. So that's good, and that's what moved us away from the precipice of war. So that's good. But then our policy has also been, you combine that with maximum pressure. So you combine non-hostile relations with maximum pressure. Maximum pressure would be some form of the joint military exercises. Probably more so yet from the North Korean. Maybe they worry more about the F-35A fighter being delivered to South Korea. But it's that combination, some sort of military push, and then mostly it's sanctions. So maximum pressure, so deep in the American psyche is the fact that if you're going to get a country to change its way, you have to squeeze it. And you have to do maximum pressure. You've heard that term with respect to Iran a lot in the last year, so it's maximum pressure. So that's what the Americans do. That's my view. So on one hand, definitely the president has shown he would like a deal. He would like to move back even further from the precipice of war. But the overall establishment believes you have to do that by at the same time sanctioning them. So as I would look at that from a North Korean side, I said, well, look, if you're going to do non-hostile relations, that's not consistent, with maximum pressure. You can't do both. You either have non-hostile or you have maximum pressure. So the North Koreans then respond, and again, let me caution that I really don't know. You know North Korea much better than I do. The way the North Koreans respond is with a similar approach, and that is, yes, non-hostile relations, friendship. And I know you've seen the latest stamp, from North Korea with President Trump and Kim Chung-in and Panmunjom. So here they are. So this shows a friendship, a relationship with the Americans. So it's non-hostile to the Americans at the highest level. However, they're going to counter maximum pressure with maximum military readiness. So if things don't go well on this friendship end, we have to make sure we can defend ourselves. And so that's the way that I would view, these latest rocket and missile tests. They're going to make sure, or even the threat of a submarine. Quite frankly, I'm not worried about their submarine, but they show the submarine, so it's all there. This shows both internally and to the world, hey, look, we're going to be ready. If something goes bad, we're going to be ready. So I think friendship or non-hostile relations plus maximum pressure begets non-hostile relations with maximum military preparedness. So the issue is going to be who's going to make the next move to get us out of that relationship. So I'm drawing close to the end, and I'll just say from my standpoint, what's most important now at this point? First, still, you have to address and manage the security risks. No nuclear war. In fact, no war, because once both sides, American side, North Korean side, have nuclear weapons, war can easily lead to nuclear war, and that's what we have to avoid. So no nuclear war. But also, so no nuclear conflict. Second part is no nuclear accidents. Those would be disastrous in an area as highly populated as Northeast Asia. No theft, making sure that whatever they have is actually secure. And no sale or export, by the government or by the military. Those are the things that are first and foremost on my mind. But then also no nukes. Indeed, denuclearization. But for that, we must create the conditions which will take trust and time. There's no single sheet of paper, in my opinion, that's going to convince the North Koreans that everything's going to be okay if they do nuclearize. So it's going to be a process that's going to take time. And then, if they're going to denuclearize, we have to normalize. So that's what the Singapore statement said. Actually, only one of the 4 parts of that statement was denuclearization. The other 3 were aimed in the direction of normalization. You got to do both. You can't just insist on one. So, for that then, the most immediate next steps, to me, on that first part, is indeed Yongbyon. Dismantle Yongbyon first. I must say that Yongbyon is a big deal. The most important part over here is no nuclear test. No nuclear test. It's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to have a hydrogen bomb. It's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to miniaturize these for those missiles. And then over here, again, particularly as far as ICBMs, is no missile tests. So that would be the focus of my approach. And of course, they've already said no nuclear tests. They've done no nuclear tests since September 3rd, 2017. They've done no long-range missile tests since November 29th of 2017. In fact, for 522 days, they didn't do any missile tests until May of this year. So going in with that sort of approach would at least give you a way to phase things. And then, of course, one of the big controversies coming out of Hanoi, when from the best that I understand, when the North Koreans offered up to close down Yongbyon, is they didn't specify until the very end, and presumably when it's already too late, that Yongbyon actually means all of Yongbyon, everything in Yongbyon. And everything in Yongbyon is huge. It's a huge deal. It's the enterprise that really governs that first part, which governs the size of their arsenal. And for those who call it an old, outdated, facility, forget it. Those facilities are all newer than most of the facilities in my home place at Los Alamos, New Mexico. The latest plutonium facility that we built was 1978. Their reactor didn't even start until 1986. And if you watch, you can see they continue. New buildings, new dams on the river, new cooling capability. They're continuously working on this place. They're working on tritium extraction facilities. This place is up and running. For them to shut this whole thing down is a huge step. Now, as people criticize, it doesn't mean they get rid of even a single nuclear weapon. That's true, because the nuclear weapons are not in Yongbyon. It doesn't mean that they can continue to design nuclear weapons. That's true, because we can't control their computers from Yongbyon. And it doesn't mean that they can make no more highly enriched uranium, because they have another facility someplace. They can make some, but they can't make plutonium. They can't make tritium. So you have to put all of those sort of into a risk formula. And to me, at this point, they shut down Yongbyon first. That's a big step. So we laid out already, just before the Singapore summit, my colleagues and I, Bob Carlin, Elliot Serban and I, laid out, so what does it take to denuclearize? So much in the same way that I just showed you of what it takes for nuclear assets. So from the weapons to the personnel, to nuclear tests, to missile tests, to plutonium, the hydrogen fuels, uranium, and no export. So we lay all of those out. Those are the things that it takes. And then right after we showed that, it was indeed part of the administration that said North Korea has to do the Libya model. Okay, the Libya model means you get rid of everything right away. The CVID, as it was called at that time, complete verifiable, irreversible dismantlement. Everything goes. Well, we said, that's not possible. They're not going to do that. So why put your effort into that if that's a negotiation? It just doesn't work. It requires declaration and elimination. They're not going to do that right away. It's equivalent to a full-out surrender. They're not ready to surrender. Instead, take steps. And so what we laid out, instead of the red, we said, look, there are some things that you can manage. And so we color those in yellow. And say, so don't ask for everything in red right away. We can manage these yellow things, and that will take time. So what we said, instead of the one-time Libya model, is focus first to halt. In other words, don't let it get worse. So we said at that time, so take a year, and they could make sure that it would halt. And then roll back. So don't just say you're going to stop, but actually make specific moves to roll back the program. And then eventually focus on elimination. And we said we don't know how long it's going to take, but a good guess was sort of 1 year for this, 2 to 5, and then up to 10 years. And in that time, if you take those steps and go down, you can build up the trust and on each side in order to get to where you want to go. And in the end, here what's left in red means all of the things in red are those that directly would help their nuclear weapons program. You can't do those. You've got to get rid of the red. So in other words, the weapons, they got to go. So this isn't a question of saying North Korea will remain a nuclear weapons state. No, they can't have nuclear weapons. Otherwise, I don't see how we can come to an agreement. But it's going to take time, to get there. And then some of the other things like, is it possible for North Korea to do a space launch? Well, I would say that may indeed be possible. Because whereas space launch in 1998, 2006 would teach them a lot about missiles, today they know all that stuff about missiles already. The space launch doesn't help them anymore to do missiles for bombs. And so it's a different trade-off than you had before. So what I'm proposing is to say, look, you can do this. You can look at the risks that each of these steps would actually engender, and then make the decision. And then we actually put words in all of these as to what it would take, to get there in that sort of a time frame. So we show what you have to decommission, what you'd have to eliminate, which you'd have to dismantle and decommission. And at the time, that was not very well accepted in Washington, because it would seem you're going to give these guys all that time for 10 years to keep the nuclear weapons. But if we had followed those, we'd be in the rollback stage for sure already by now, along a different path. So what's the hope now? And by the way, over here, for example, I said one of the most important thing is no nuclear test. Moratorium or suspend. They've done that. And then when you get to the missile test, we said no intermediate range or no ICBMs. But we also said no solid rocket motor tests. Those are the ones they did now, in May through August. So if one had followed this sort of a chart, maybe one wouldn't have gone to that step of the solid rocket motor tests. But they did, so now they know more, so it's going to make this more complicated. Okay, so what are the chances today? Well, sort of the best, as you know, lots of things have happened in Washington the past few weeks' time. And Steve Biegun, the special representative, gave a very important speech at the University of Michigan on September 6th. And here's more or less what I tried to extract from his talk. And quite frankly, it's very encouraging. It's very encouraging. He in essence says, this is going to take some time. It is going to have to be phased. And they don't have to bear it all, and we don't have to bear it all. We have to go through this together. And the route to denuclearization is through normalization and peace. And that's exactly right. So in other words, you have to give. I haven't talked yet. What does North Korea get in return? Well, to me, the most important thing is you have to ask them. But if they don't answer the phone, then you can't ask them. And so Steve Biegun also says, they need to get it together and make sure that they can quickly agree to significant actions with the U.S. And they've not done that, now, essentially since Singapore, and certainly not since Hanoi. He says President Trump, continues to be committed to achieve these results. And so I think with that, hopefully, if one can actually get back to the negotiating table, take the sort of approach that I've indicated, where you do step-by-step, phased in both directions, make sure that you ask them, what do they want? Hanoi, they featured the sanctions relief. Since Hanoi, they've said, no, we're not so interested in sanctions relief anymore. We have to address the security issues. Well, I've sort of said all along, you have to do both. I mean, if they don't feel secure, they're not going to go there regardless of how hard you squeeze them. So you have to tackle the security issues, and you have to talk to them to understand what will help. And then there has to be sanctions relief. And to me, the encouraging part there is, at least until a few months ago, the relationship between South and North appeared to be so good that that's really the place where the economic development has to take place, where all of those discussions as to what can be done in order to draw the North closer to the South through some form of tailored sanction relief in order to make progress that will help them on their side. So that's what I consider to be pretty meaningful, hopeful way forward, and I will stop, and Chung-in, you can come up, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time.
Why don't you come this way?
So I didn't look at my watch, but I'm glad you good time.
Your presentation really has been a daily. Okay. But let me just clarify one thing. This event is organized by the two organizations. One is APLN, APLN refers to Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And Garrett Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia, is the chairman. I'm serving as vice chairman and executive director. And another organization of East Asia Foundation. East Asia Foundation has been running this kind of seminar for the past 12 years. But with regard to the WMD, weapons of mass destruction related topics, we have decided to hold a joint seminar between APLN and East Asia Foundation. This is the first effort ever made by APLN and East Asia Foundation. Okay, with that background, instead of talking among us, why don't I just open the floor, because there are government, senior government officials, diplomatic officers, and some leading journalists, and particularly we have a leading expert from our nuclear energy community, in the research community. Okay, now we have a reporter from the Yonhap News first, and then Dr. Hwang Yong-soo. Okay.
Chung-in came from the Yonhap News. Back in June, President Moon said in an interview that dismantling Yongbyon would mean that denuclearization of North Korea has entered an irreversible stage. Did you hear my question?
Yeah, but please repeat. I couldn't quite hear.
Back in June, President Moon said in an interview that dismantling Yongbyon would mean that denuclearization of North Korea has entered an irreversible stage. Do you agree with that statement? And how significant is Yongbyon in terms of North Korea's entire nuclear program?
So if I understand correctly, you say it was said that essentially shutting down, thank you. Shutting down Yongbyon would be irreversible.
No, here. There is some confusion. You use the shutting down, closing down. But when President Moon says that if North Korea dismantle all the nuclear facilities in Yongbyon completely and finally, and that will signify the initial phase of steps toward the irreversible denuclearization. Of course, some elements in South Korea and the United States strongly oppose that idea. Okay, but when you give a presentation on Yongbyon, you said that the shutting down, but the way North Korea presented to the United States in Hanoi was that we will completely and finally dismantle nuclear facilities in Yongbyon. Why did you use the term shutting down? And also, as the reporter from Yonhap News argues, if North Korea decides to dismantle nuclear facilities in Yongbyon completely and finally, okay, can it be constituted as meaningful steps toward the irreversible stage of denuclearization?
Right. So Professor Moon, of course, knows all of the details and reads between the lines and all of that. So he knows. So and he also noticed that I very carefully did not say eliminate. And so let me answer that question first as to why did I choose to just shut down. I find it almost inconceivable that North Korea would just go ahead and say, we will eliminate all of Yongbyon. There's just too much there at Yongbyon, and there will be the question is some of those facilities indeed may be quite useful for civilian nuclear power. And would he just throw that out there and say we're going to eliminate anything? My own view is they will have to look at what was actually said and then say maybe, hey, wait a minute, we didn't quite mean we're going to eliminate everything. We're going to eliminate all of those things that have a weapon connection. So that's why I very carefully said for the time being just shut down. But, however, I also by that, I don't mean just suspend. So for example, the 5-megawatt reactor was suspended, frozen in 1994. They restarted it without much of a problem in 2003. They shut it down again in 2007, and then they restarted again in 2013. So this time, what I mean is the 5 megawatt reactor, since that's a plutonium producing weapons related reactor, kill it. So there's no just shutting down, it's kill it this time. And there are ways to kill it where they could never restart that
There's
reactor.
elimination then.
Right. So,
Elimination.
yeah, so they'll eliminate that.
What you're saying is that shutting down in the first place, and then selective elimination of critical components like 5 megawatt nuclear reactors or tritium laboratories, right? And highly enriched uranium facilities. Or should they be retained? What, red line or?
Well, so what I showed on my curve, on my graph, my color chart, to be determined through discussion. At this point, I don't see how it could be viable for commercial production of low-enriched uranium.
Then in your interpretation in regard to the question from the Yonhap News reporter, then when we talk about shutting down of the Yongbyon facilities, it cannot be construed as being significant steps toward the irreversible denuclearization of North Korea.
Yeah, so again, the words are tricky. So let me say, shutting down and eliminating much of Yongbyon is a big deal and a very positive step. It does not end North Korea's nuclear program. It actually, in terms of irreversible, the CVID, the I part is irreversible. Nothing is irreversible short of the loss of human memory. And so anything can be. The question is, how long would it take them? Would they be able to continue to scale up and make their nuclear program more dangerous? In my opinion, it would be if you have no long-range missile tests, you have no nuclear tests, you have no Yongbyon, that would dramatically think. Does it end it altogether? No, it doesn't end.
Dr. Hwang Young-soo. Please raise your hand so that I can reserve, okay?
Steve, I really appreciate your comprehensive presentation today. I really like your color chart, as I already mentioned to you in your NCNL in this spring. I have two questions. Actually, those two questions are interlinked. First of all is the how to manage it. I direct use the terminology of the manage, not dismantle or the shutdown the Yongbyon facility. As you know, there are more than 300 buildings in Yongbyon site. So to shut down and to eliminate all the buildings in Yongbyon within a matter of a year is impossible. And so it will be very difficult. And as you already pointed out today, we have to worry about how to use their human beings, the brains, and their commercial industry for the future. For example, they need radioisotope for their industrial application and the medical application. And even though we have to shut down 5 megawatt reactor, and probably the IRT 2000 reactor, which is still used some highly enriched uranium, we might have to replace something to Yongbyon to support their medical approach and the industrial approach in the foreseeable future. That's also linked with how to manage all the brains in DPRK. And as far as I remember throughout the conversation between you and me, when things are not so bad in 2007, I remember that you had a conversation with Ligon about taking care of the human resources in DPRK. Without taking care of properly managing the DPRK human resources, you cannot go for the real denuclearization or real...
Dr. Wang, would you make it short? Yes. Because so many...
Real non-proliferation. So do you have any idea how to interlink the denuclearization and managing the human resources in DPRK for the eventual denuclearization?
And second question?
Actually, that's my second question.
Okay.
How to manage the human beings?
Okay.
So very insightful and very good and important question. So first of all, in terms of shutting down and eliminating the Yongbyon site, it will be an enormous undertaking. So you first have to, those facilities that you need to get rid of, you have to decontaminate, and then you have to dismantle. And then eventually you have to do the environmental remediation of that. Those are projects that are sort of at least 10-year time scale and huge number of people. And so first of all, what's most important is the North Korean technical specialists themselves should do most of that work, with the advice of people from Kerry, for example, and people from the United States and other countries. So that's all manageable. It just is going to take a lot of time and a lot of money to do so, to do it right. In terms of human resources, Chung-in mentioned I had done this sort of work with Russia. I've been to Russia 56 times since 1992, mostly in that direction as to what to do about their nuclear facilities and the people and the redirection of their people. So we have a lot of experience that we could use. And the single most important lesson is if you want to know what to do with their human resources, go ask them. That's what we did with the Russians. And so I did. I asked Director Lee Hang-suk in 2007. So because it looked like it might be possible to shut down Yongbyon facilities in 2007, 2008. And he told me, he said, we want to make nuclear electricity for our country. We want to make medical isotopes because we need them here. And so that's what you need to ask. And there are many ways that you can employ them. But then Ambassador Lee Gun added to that. He said, I'm not just worried about my technical people. They'll be okay. But what about the factory workers? Can you do something about the factory workers in nearby Yongbyon City? They used to have a silk factory. Is there some way that one can help those factory workers? Those are all the things that are very doable, and what I would consider most encouraging is if we have good North-South relations, that's where sort of the industrial enterprise can be brought in to help the North Korean workers to find a place to do something useful for their people.
Okay, Director General Lim from the National Security Council, and then Ambassador Shin. Okay, Ambassador Shin was our ambassador to Vienna.
Thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate your very comprehensive briefings. I totally agree with you, many points. In particular, one, the Yongbyon is very important standpoint. Second, it will take a long time to complete the CBI time. My question is two things. One, apart from the brains or human resources, intangible knowledge, we have to be very realistic. We are talking about the total elimination of the Yongbyon facilities. Or we have past year, back in 1994 and 2005, which dealt with the shutdown or disablement. But we are now talking about more than shutdown, more than disablement, but total elimination. And it should be done by US experts or IA experts. So in doing so, we can find out the past activities of nuclear activities by nuclear archaeology. Or we can just upload the present or future capabilities. So it should be the first point of no return to lead us to the final denuclearization. So apart from the 10-year, 20-year of dealing with the nuclear scientists, their brains, but we have to focus on very realistic what DPRK already committed, the total elimination of the Yongbyon nuclear facilities. Second thing is that we think that sometime in late September or early October, there will be maybe possibly resumption of the working level negotiations between the two. So because we witnessed that Hanoi failed, and there are some skepticism, but we have another chance of the working level negotiations, and we have to narrow down the agenda. DPRK, they want to have another agenda, big agenda like the security guarantees, or Washington, they want to keep focus on the CBID or FFBD, but this time we have to find a middle ground to narrow the gap in the approaching or the agenda. So my question is that if you are the head delegation to the table sitting with the DPRK, what will be your agenda, sir? How to start? When we have to start in resuming the working level negotiations?
So let me tackle the second question first and say I won't answer that. Because that's the job of the negotiations. What really needs to happen, negotiations need to begin. Real negotiation. That's hard work. It's give and take. You never know exactly where you start and where you're going to finish. You have to talk. And so for me to sit here and say this is the way it should be laid out is just not possible. You had it all right. Yes, that's what it's going to require, and that's where Special Representative Began will come in, with his consultation with South Korea, and so that will be taken care of. Then your first points are all very, very good points. Absolutely, that's the way it has to happen. One has to look specifically. What I tried to do with these charts is, to me, these are risk-based charts. And so they have to take steps that actually reduce the risk. And they will have to make it, for example, if you eliminate the 5-megawatt reactor, that in order to fix it, it would be more than building a new one. So in other words, you really have killed it. And so I would say in each of those things, you have to take steps that reduce the risk substantially. And then, of course, then you also have to give something. But for them, you have to ask what they want, and that's negotiations. But your points are well taken.
Okay, before, yes, Ambassador Shin, and then I'll get to Ambassador Yoon. Why don't you give us some suggestion or guess on what agenda would be?
But Ambassador Yoon, he's the one who can answer.
Right, and therefore, Ambassador Shin first, and then after Ambassador Yoon. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hacker, your very comprehensive presentation and briefing, sharing your knowledge and information. My question, I'm currently working in the Korean Institute for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Control, technical control. And the second part of your answer regarding the questions of the management of the human resources, probably so my institute, KAINA, is one of those research institute located in Daedo. We can hire, employ some North Korean experts and some technicians in the long term in that area. My question is regarding the verification. It is simply, so the key part of the whole denuclearization of North Korea is verification, confirming the denuclearization process of North Korea. So once in Singapore, the President Trump, he answered regarding questions how the verification activities will be carried out. Mr. Trump said it's simply a combination of both American and international teams. So my question, so the international team is regarded by many people as IAEA. So what can be the role and the division of work between the Americans and IAEA team, plus additionally, if South Korea will be engaged in that process and participating in the verification activities, so what can be the added role, our contribution from South Korea, like KAINA, our institute is dealing with safeguards agreement and by the IAEA, so we have also experience, particularly some technical and logistical point of view based on experience. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And yes, I am familiar with KAINAC's role and capabilities, and I should have mentioned KAINAC along with Kerry. Kerry certainly on the technical aspects, whether it's fuel cycle, and KAINAC without question related to proliferation issues and arms control and so forth. So I fully understand that. Verification will remain an enormously complicated and difficult issue. There's just no question. And particularly if you get it down to where you're talking about getting rid of the last few weapons or the last few kilograms of plutonium, those can be hidden almost anywhere. And so it will be very difficult long term. In my thinking about verification, what I had proposed before, to me, the best way to speed up verification is actually if you could do what I call cooperative denuclearization. And that is that by working together with the input from Kainak Kerry, from the Americans, and then with the North Korean input, suppose they say, look, we've done this nuclear business since the 1960s. We have an enormous amount of money and talent invested in that. And like I was told by the director in 2007, we'd like to get something useful out of this, like medical isotopes. In answer to the previous question, I would build a Hanaro reactor in North Korea in Yongbyon. The IRT 2000, that one is just not worth fixing up. But a Hanaro, South Koreans build that reactor. It's beautiful. Makes medical isotopes for research. You build that, you employ their people. So that would be cooperative. Cooperative space launch, for example, is another cooperative issue. Cooperative electricity would be one. If the North Koreans would understand that they could benefit from the fact that they actually demonstrate, no, they're not doing weapons, they're doing civilian, then if they cooperate, then you could make verification easier and much, much faster. If it's adversarial, you just have to realize this is going to be a difficult process. It's been difficult in every place it's ever been done, and it's not going to be any easier here. In terms of division of labor, let's say, between American, South Korean, and or the IAEA, as most of you probably know, the North Koreans have no love for the IAEA. So in 2007, 2008, they much preferred to work with the American technical team rather than the IAEA. And I was there. I was not part of the American technical team. I was sort of an independent visitor. I was not an inspector. That's also why I saw more than any inspector has seen, because I wasn't inspecting them. They thought they could benefit if they showed me something, and if they think they can benefit, they show you more. So getting to that sort of situation, the way I would see it, so the Americans come first, because we actually have a good relationship with them, and they see the benefit of working with the Americans. And then I would, as an American, I would bring in the South Koreans, like on a Hanaro reactor or things of that nature. And then when you finally get to a point where you have it reasonably scoped out, then eventually there will be the IAEA inspectors to make sure that they're not subverting. The IAEA inspectors are in South Korea, they're in Japan, they're in all these places. And once they establish themselves as being only civilian, then you bring them in. But you bring them in at the beginning, I think you slow things down.
Okay, Joe?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Hacker. That was very, very enlightening. There aren't many places I would have any argument with you. I think regarding the questions that's arising, in my experience, you can look at simply negotiating with North Korea is all about how much denuclearization for how much normalization. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And the most important factor there is political will of the leaders. And in this case, it will be Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. But looking at it from the Washington side, there are two distinct approaches on how to deal with North Korea. One is what I call transformational approach. That is, in order to get the fundamentals, to resolve the issue once and for all, we have to have CDID, we have to have, things like human rights and so on. In other words, regime change. So there is that fundamental approach, which I call transformational. And then there is another approach, which what I call is transactional, which is you accept you cannot fundamentally change North Korea, so let's try to do something, which is what Dr. Hecker is laying out, transactionally, what is possible there. As a negotiator, everyone, all your political masters want transformational approach. They don't want to hear you say, well, it will take 20 years, you know. They want to do it within their lifetime. So as a negotiator, the trick is how to make transactional approach sound like transformational approach. Okay. So and there are several ways you can do that. One is the use of roadmap, that it will eventually get there. And the reality of Washington is that even though everyone wants transformational approach, your political masters, generally, after some experience, they are willing to try transactional approach. The problem is, unfortunately, we have elections. And whenever new people come in, they want transformational approach. And this is why it's taken. And another rule of thumb is Republicans in general are much more supportive of transformational approach than Democrats. Now, Trump is an exception. And this is why there is this opportunity created. Trump is a deal maker. He really doesn't care, transformation, transaction, as long as there is a deal. There's tremendous danger in that, as well as opportunity in that, and which is why there is this opportunity. Who would have thought Trump would meet with Kim Jong-un 3 times in 1 year? And so in the coming session, which I think you're right, very soon there'll be working level meetings. Always the starting point will be what was on the table in Yongbyon. And so in Yongbyon there was, in Hanoi, what was on the table in Hanoi. So in Hanoi we had Yongbyon, that's denuclearization, but no real offer on sanctions. So both sides have to come back home to working level and say, we got more than Hanoi. So somehow it's got to be Yongbyon plus on denuclearization, and that plus can be many things, including a site outside Yongbyon, including a nice roadmap, something on verification, but maybe most likely how to get to a real freeze. And that will be Yongbyon plus. And the North Korean side, they must get something on sanctions, whether it's on coal, textiles, oil, some relief. And then on top of that, if you add, say, end of war declaration, if you add opening of liaison offices, you can tell your boss, yeah, it's kind of transformational.
Okay, any one last and final question, comment? Yes, Dr. Chung.
I really appreciate your presentation, Professor Hecker. As a technical person, I have 2 technical questions. You indicated that the tritium ability of DPRK is very limited. On what basis you may say very limited? Is it technically the amount they have produced, or is the ability in regard to ability of their future production of tritium? That's one question. And the other question is in regard to experimental PWR they are building in Yongbyon site. I have never heard the story of the internal construction of the experimental PWR. Is it a real PWR or a model house for future negotiation.
Well, as many things about North Korea, the first thing I can say, I don't really know. but I'm going to give you what I think. So as far as the experimental light water reactor, is it a Potemkin village, more or less, is what you're saying, that they just put the outside up and are not serious? I don't believe it. I think they were very serious about building an experimental light water reactor. I spoke at length to the chief engineer for that reactor in November of 2010. I asked him a lot of questions about how they intend to build it, what it's going to look like, what the materials are, and he was he was the same person who was chief engineer before for the 5 megawatt reactor, so I'd met him before. He was very straightforward, very competent, and he gave me, I thought, very acceptable answers that at that time, a lot of the details had not yet been fully determined. For example, I asked him, will you have uranium oxide fuel, which, as you know, since you're an expert in this business, that's what light water reactors use. And he said, yes, of course. Then I said, is the cladding, what you put around the uranium oxide, is it going to be stainless steel, which I thought they could manage how to make it, or is it a zirconium alloy, zircaloy? And he said, we have not yet decided. And I think, again, that was true. From what we've seen as they built along all the way, and as we watch whatever comes out of their reactor now, I think they're very serious in developing it. They, without question, have cooling issues. It's a much bigger reactor than the 5 megawatt, and it's a light water reactor and not a graphite reactor. And if you watch what they've done, they've put in place the cooling capacities for those 2 reactors. And I don't think they would do that if it was just an external frame. So I think they're doing it, but they're finding that a light water reactor is just much more complicated than what they do as gas graphite. So in terms of the tritium, so there are 2 aspects. One is what I put on the chart meant mostly how much tritium could they have, and I say limited. And I make that judgment mostly on the amount that the 5 megawatt reactor has been operating since they restarted operations. And it's just not much, and so they just couldn't have made. And whenever if you put in, as you know, the lithium-6 to be able to make the tritium, that means you're not making as much, plutonium in the reactor. So they had to, worry about how much plutonium, how much tritium. We don't think they made much. However, as in most other things with the North Koreans, they're very competent. They will eventually get there. And from what we can see, they're building serious capabilities of tritium laboratories to reprocess tritium. So their plans are without question to greatly increase the tritium production. That could be done either by continuing to run the 5 megawatt or getting the experimental light water reactor up and running. The other part of the tritium is how well can they design hydrogen bombs and how sophisticated. Well, I believe that the September 3rd, 2017 test was most likely a tritium, meaning a hydrogen bomb. How sophisticated it was, it's not possible. They showed a bomb casing that they claimed was their hydrogen bomb. I'm not sure whether that's what they tested. And it's for a missile, you need something small to put on a missile. For an underground test, you can have a huge device. So what they demonstrated, they most likely know how to make a fusion bomb, but I'm not convinced, and without further nuclear testing, I don't think they can make a militarily useful fusion bomb. That's why no nuclear testing, no long-range missile testing is really important.
Dr. Hacker, thank you very much for your very informative and very enlightening presentation. Let's give a big applause. 대단히 감사합니다. Thank you very much. We could have spent more time for Q&A, but he gave a too long presentation, 1 hour. Anyhow, it was very good. Okay, thank you.